Hello and welcome to episode 30 of the Wilder podcast. In this episode, we speak with Matt Walpole, CEO of Cornwall Wildlife Trust. He tells us the ambitious story of Toward to Shore, the landscape scale recovery project. We discuss the vision, the challenges, and just why scale really matters. Good evening, Tom.
Hello. Don't hate me.
Stop laughing at me.
We got there in the end. That's good. Go, I'll tell you what, I feel lighter after our last episode.
It's nice to punctuate, isn't it? To put all the things that have been bubbling around in your head into an audio summary of the journey to date.
Yeah. For those that maybe are new to the podcast, one thing that's quite interesting that we did forget to do on the last episode was give an update of who we are and what we do. So maybe we'll start on that when we'll move on to the rest of the podcast. So we are husband and wife, Chloe and Tom, and a year and a half ago, we made the reckless, interesting, exciting decision, whatever you want to call it, to move to Monmouthshire and take on a 80-acre farm here in Wales and focus on rewilding without any particular background in ecology or nature recovery or indeed rewilding. So we felt that the podcast would be a great place to learn and hopefully bring everyone along the journey with us. And there's a lot more going on. So what I would recommend, if you are new to the podcast and if you get to the end of this one and you think that's quite interesting, then just go back one episode and you'll get a full update on what's been happening, what we've been doing over the last 12 plus months. And what we try to do is release an episode every couple of weeks or so and provide a short update as to what we've done over that intervening period. So, Chloe, come on, give me your top level of most interesting thing that's happened over the last 2 weeks.
I'm going to nail down on today, where it's been a beautiful sunny day in Wales. I don't know about anyone else. And I got invited to a Wye Valley Network rewilding event with the one and only Professor Alistair Driver of Rewilding Britain.
And when you say is that because my invite was lost in the post? Because you forgot to tell me you were going on this, which is an interesting omission. Then you came back and said, I've been hobnobbing with everybody.
You can make that meaning of what you will. I don't know.
Just forgot, didn't you?
Maybe just fancied a day out by myself. But it was lovely. It was great to see everyone.
I bet it was.
It's such a joy to be part of the network, which is so expertly organised by Victoria and Tim.
Hang on, before we move on, just not that I don't want to let go of it, but did anyone ask about me?
No. Lovely chats, but no one asked about you. No,
great.
Just to reflect briefly on the value of being part of a network, it's such a great resource of knowledge, enthusiasm, debate, and I just so appreciate the opportunity to walk and talk and see some fantastic examples of rewilding sites in the Wye Valley. It was an absolute pleasure to be there, but I wanted to share with the listeners my two favourite Ali Driver rewilding facts.
Go on then. I mean, he is a font of all knowledge.
So you know I love data. And Professor Driver has got this fantastic spreadsheet where he documents a number of variables over the rewilding sites that he supports and has been doing so for the last 7 or 8 years.
Well, he's done that for our site. When he was here, he got his laptop out and we were having scones and drinking tea and filling in all the data about our project. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is his analysis of some of the changes that he's noticed during his time managing said spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. And my two favourite facts were, firstly, in terms of livestock units produced, so this is the meat essentially that comes off the projects, it has in fact only halved. So in a transition from a fairly intensive sheep farm, for example, where you've got billiard table grasslands, by the removal of the sheep, and the introduction of cattle, actually they only reduce their meat production by half. And then you get all the other fantastic benefits of rewilding projects in terms of ecotourism, some of the grant stuff you can get access to, obviously the benefits for nature. I was quite shocked by that because sometimes there's a bit of a division between rewilding and farming, but actually what that shows to me is it's much closer than you think.
That is actually really interesting. And I think obviously the reductionist viewpoint instantly will be, but you can't, if you half all the production in the whole country, then there's not going to be enough food. But that's not what anyone is saying. What that data is saying is the impact won't be quite as stark on the areas that have decided to become rewilding sites. It's actually not as extreme as one might say.
And channeling Ali today, he in fact said that the first thing we need to tackle is the fact that 40% of our food is wasted before we start worrying about the slight reduction in meat production in the UK, which is you can't really argue against that. And my second fact is the fact that rewilding projects are at minimum doubling the number of employed people for each site. And he recognised that the numbers aren't massive. Like, we're not talking about apart from NEP, where they're employing 50 people now. But for a lot of these rural contexts, any additional jobs are really appreciated. So it was just a nice thing to celebrate as well. The fact is actually rewilding is bringing people back into rural economies as opposed to pushing them out, which is sometimes an argument I think that gets presented against rewilding projects.
Didn't you say when you came back that Ali Driver said in front of a whole group of people that he enjoys listening to our podcast.
While he's on his allotment, yes, he did.
There we go. Love that. That's awesome. Okay, cool. I've learned a lot just through you. I mean, I would have learned probably more if I was there.
I don't be sore about it.
Okay, so would you like my bit of reflection from the week?
Go for it.
Can't have an episode go by where I don't talk about the pigs.
Here we go again.
And in
I'll
fact,
just sit down, get a cup of tea.
I feel like you're bullying me today. So not only do we talk quite significantly about pigs in the interview, but also because it's been getting significantly wetter around the area, and this is the first time we've had pigs, as we walk around the project, they've done some significant disturbance and rootling, which is exactly what we want them to do. But then you can now see the little puddles inside these micro habitats being created, and you can just see it before your eyes, the impact and value it has. So I thought what I would do is educate you, Chloe, and the listeners through you on the things I've learned that the micro habitats will do to our rewilding project.
I'm excited.
Right. So the first bit is really obvious. As they rootle, they push away all the top level of soil, but grass and anything getting in the way of seeds dropping onto that soil, that exposed soil. And obviously that's a brilliant fertile habitat for diverse vegetation to grow out of. Mm-hmm. So the next point is the uneven ground like we discussed. The rain then settles in there, creates these tiny small pools, which temporarily increases the local levels of moisture. And these damp areas can support things like amphibians, insects, moisture-loving plants, mosses and fungi.
It's almost like tiny mini ponds.
Tiny mini ponds, mini micro-habitats. And so when you walk around the project, there's hundreds of these now across the whole 30 acres where we've sequestered them away. Probably not the right term, but we've put them away while we've got building work on the education centre or the Wilder Lodge. So they've got 30 acres, not the normal 80 that they have to explore. But there are hundreds of them. And so these are all hundreds of different types of micro-habitats. So as they are rootling as well, they're exposing underground fungi, which is cool. And what that allows them to do is the exposed fungi underground, their spores then can spread further and wider. So we're helping fungi spread their seed, which I think is quite cool. I say we, like we're doing any of the work. You still with me? I've got one last point.
I'm ready.
So if anyone hasn't seen what rootal ground looks like, you might be forgiven in thinking that it might be, it's a slightly disturbed soil. That's what you might think pigs do, but it's not. They are quite aggressive in their rootling, and some really dense areas, the rootling can be down to like 20 or so inches or 30 centimetres of depth. And it's significant. And what that apparently will lead to is amazing conditions for ground nesting birds. And I just think, yet again, we wouldn't have had that if the pigs weren't doing that. We're going to be helping our ground nesting bird population, which have taken a fair whacking in recent years.
Could you love the pigs any more, Tom?
No, absolutely not, is the answer. And I think people should come and see them because they're brilliant. They make your life 100 times better.
No small exaggeration. So should we get into the interview for today?
Yes, please, because there's more conversation about pigs in the interview, so let's go.
It was a real joy speaking with Matt. He is such a clear communicator, and he really covered the challenges, the opportunities, the vision, the importance of scale on every level for the Tortoiseshore project, which I think both of us left quite inspired by.
Yeah, and it's no secret that what I love is strategic level discussions, and this is just one of them. It's how do we affect change, but through a lens of realism and realistic challenges associated with it. So here it is.
Hi Matt, and welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Hi Chloe, it's lovely to be here.
And evidence of how keen Tom and I were to hear more about the Tortoiseshore project is that we both reached out independently to the Wildlife Trust to ask for this interview. And aside from highlighting perhaps poor podcast admin, it kind of highlights our enthusiasm for this conversation today.
Well, that's nice. No, it's great to have the chance to talk about it.
So before we hear more about the Tortoiseshore project, it'd be wonderful to hear a bit about your story and what drew you into the role of CEO for Cornwall Wildlife Trust.
Sure. Well, so I grew up in Cornwall many, many years ago, and then obviously headed off to college and the outside world beckoned. So I got into wildlife conservation, but very much focused on the international scene. I was drawn away as a student to Borneo and then from there into East Africa. So I did a lot of crazy stuff in all sorts of places, and that kept me entertained for a long, long time, as you can imagine. But as time went on and my career progressed, I started to get a little bit more interested in what was happening back at home, back in the UK, where, of course, we struggle with the nature depletion that we experience here in comparison to many other parts of the world. But with that brings huge innovation. And I started to begin to see what the Wildlife Trust and others were doing in terms of nature recovery, all sorts of phenomenal things happening. And I became a trustee for one of the Wildlife Trusts upcountry for a number of years. and thought, you know what, maybe I need to sit on the other side of this table. So I started to look around, and then out of nowhere, the opportunity to come back to Cornwall came up. The place I grew up, the place that means most to me, and I couldn't do anything but jump at that opportunity. So I swapped jet setting and exotic faraway places to somewhere a little bit more domestic, but no less wild.
There's something about coming home, isn't there, and the heart that's associated with that. And I think particularly with nature and place, that those connections can feel really, really strong. So for people that don't know anything about Cornwall Wildlife Trust, what would be important for listeners to understand about the organisation?
So as you probably know, we're one of 46 wildlife trusts across the country. We're in Cornwall. We span the whole of the county from Land's End in the west all the way to the Tamar on the border with Devon in the east. We've been around for about 60 years. It was started by a group of really passionate volunteers, I guess, and naturalists who saw what was happening to nature and wanted to try and work to stem that tide. And like many wildlife trusts, it started to build itself up around small nature reserves, acquiring pieces of land, and then ultimately building a membership organisation around that to support the work that was happening on those reserves. And 60 odd years later, we have around 59 reserves all the way across the county, about 5,500 acres in total. But that's the foundation, if you like. But so much of what we do is beyond our reserves. It's working in the wider landscapes, wider seascapes. It's working with communities. It's working with landowners. It's working with marine users. It's working with politicians, businesses. Because the reality is we're not going to turn the tide on nature loss simply by working in the little spaces that we can acquire and that we can protect. We have to change what society's doing. We have to work with far more people taking action for nature. So what we do is try and ensure that we inspire people, that we educate people, that we give people options, we enable people to take action in whatever sphere of life they happen to be, whether that's at home in their own gardens, whether it's in their communities and community groups, whether it's in their businesses and with landowners, whether it's over the wider countryside around the reserves that we manage ourselves.
And in terms of the landscape of Cornwall, I'm guessing most people are jumping straight to the traditional Cornish seaside scape. But once you kind of get into the more internal areas, how would you describe the makeup or the topography, or there's probably a better word to describe it, but you know what I'm trying to say,
yes.
of the Cornish county?
So we're lucky in Cornwall. It is a wild place in many senses. And of course, everybody knows the fabulous coastline. We're surrounded on coast all the way around, bar our border with Devon. And inland, of course, you've got those iconic moorland landscapes, Bodmin Moor, Penwith Moor down in the west with their rocky outcrops and tors. But 75% of Cornwall, like so much of the UK, is farmed. It's a farmed landscape, perhaps a little different to other parts of the country in that we've still got lots of smaller fields, lots of hedgerows, lots of opportunity there for nature and lots of opportunity for nature recovery. But it is still, despite its wildness, it is a fairly managed landscape.
The term that comes out a lot of this podcast is like this idea of rewilding, and what does rewilding mean? And I'm curious about what relationship the Wildlife Trust has with rewilding, whether it's something that you were using historically, whether it's something that's come into the scene more recently, and what's the connection really between the Wildlife Trust and this idea of rewilding?
Well, of course, like so many organisations, we've for many, many years, decades, been involved in habitat management to improve landscapes for wildlife, for species, for threatened species. But rewilding, of course, it suggests something slightly different, which is perhaps in some ways stepping back from that very intensive management of nature into something where you're letting nature do its own thing. I think for some, it's become associated with this idea that we're all about wanting to bring wolves and lynx and all these, sort of large apex species back into the mix. In fact, for us, because so many of the landscapes are still relatively small, the idea that you can simply let go isn't going to take you where you want to be. So there's always got to be some form of management or manipulation, if you like. But for us, what rewilding is all about is about the principles of letting go a bit, the principles of less human intervention and mechanization. So where we're moving to, particularly on our larger reserves, and we'll talk a bit about tortoise shore, is using herbivores to play a part in the landscape that they would have once done. And in the absence of some of the wilder herbivores like bison or elk or whatever it might be, we're working with domesticated animals, but often it's the rarer breeds, to simulate what the wild herbivores would have done in those landscapes in order to create the diversity, to create the processes which allow more species to thrive and more nature to recover.
And is that something that you've been doing always, I guess, in that kind of 60-year history? Or is that something, that kind of principle of practice has been something that's come in more recently as the rewilding movement, I guess, has increased in popularity?
Yeah. So I think the difference is that whereas in the past, and certainly in some places in the present, we would use livestock as well as mechanization to manage for a particular habitat outcome. Because in a particular area, or for a particular grant or funding scheme, there's a need to support a particular outcome, which relates to a particular species or a particular habitat. What rewilding brings, I think, is the sense that there may be something a little bit more unknown or chaotic in what comes. So it's not about creating a certain thing in a certain space. It's about creating processes that allow lots of different things to thrive. So there's an unknown element, a surprise element to it, which I think is fabulous. One of the examples of that, I guess, in our context is the arrival of beavers. And what beavers will do in a landscape, can create fabulous things, but also, things that you don't know until it happens. How are you going to be able to manage that? Of course, there's always the need to think about some of the key priority species, the threatened species, and what we're doing to ensure that they have space, they have what they need to survive. But within that, the idea that over larger scales, you can put in place the processes that allow nature to do its thing and respond to the environment around it, I think that's very exciting.
While hearing you describe just Cornwall, it's making me think is I need to get back down to Cornwall. I need to come and visit. I need to come and have a look because I just love it. I think for me, as many people, it holds a magical place kind of in my heart. Before we get into the deeper dive, for lack of a much better term, of Tortoise Shore, I just want to dwell on the term rewilding. Has it been a conscious decision to adopt that term? And if it has, what were the considerations that you had to make when choosing to pick that term in terms of potential detractors, people who may be negative or be concerned about using that term?
Tom, we thought a lot about that. You've hit on a particularly important point. It has been a term that has caused, some, I guess, diversity of opinion around whether, what it means even, and whether it's a good thing. We put a piece out in a magazine 18 months or so ago describing what it was that we meant by the term. And in fact, we held a panel discussion with our members. We had about 200 members turn up. It was really lively with a bunch of speakers, some external speakers, who are prominent in this space, some of our staff as well. Because the issue at the heart of everything, again, for us, is that we take people with us. And that's really key. So we wanted people to understand what we were meaning when we used the term. And we did and ah about whether or not it was a term we wanted to use. But it does hold some meaning in terms of the direction of travel, the positivity of a recovery and a change in the right direction. Wild, wilderness, it's all relative, isn't it? The use of the term, as I say, as we've used it, it's very much about a managed return to a set of natural processes to the extent that can be done within the landscapes that we have some custodianship for. So it's not at one or other of the extreme ends that people might perceive the word to be. And I think as long as you're clear on how you're using a term, then that's absolutely fine. What's very interesting is when you go beyond concepts and definitions and into what that really means on the ground is how excited people get and how extraordinarily excited we've all got, and our members and the public have got, around livestock on nature reserves and the things that pigs can do when you let them loose in a landscape like that.
Let's talk about this. Let's ignore Tortoise Shore. Let's talk about pigs on landscape, because I agree completely. And sorry, I got excited there because it is, as listeners of the podcast will absolutely know, it's transformational, the effect that I think that having these animals doing a job on a landscape and you can see them doing it has on not only the landscape, but on the people visiting. So anyway, I'll pause there, come back to you were making the point, but yeah, I agree.
Well, it's true, isn't it? I mean, we're very used to cattle and ponies grazing, particularly grazing on the landscapes. Cattle can do a bit more than that, of course. But pigs as real ecosystem engineers, as you know, the way they really disrupt the soil. In the Tortoise Shore landscape, the particular reason we wanted pigs initially was because of areas that were very inundated with bracken and wanting to really open that up and seeing what they could do. And what's been interesting there is that they'll disappear into it. But in fact, even though they can have a really significant impact on the landscape, we've had to almost corral them, if you like, so that we keep them in smaller areas so that they really hit that stuff hard. And then you start to see a shift on that. You put them on some more open pasture and they just tear through it incredibly, because that's going to open things up and we're going to see all sorts of seeds getting in there, all sorts of things growing as a result of it.
Last point on pigs before we move into the kind of main effort for this conversation, which is the Tortoise Shore project, is I think it's really interesting what you were saying about how people have responded to the idea of livestock being on these nature reserves, because I think there's something about how there's two things really. I think there's something about the magic of not knowing when you go around a corner what you're going to see. And that creates a bit of an element of surprise and excitement, but also a slight element of, I don't want to say fear because I think that's too big a word, but there's something about how we need to be able to respect the wilderness of nature. And part of that involves maybe coming across pigs or cows or ponies as you come around a corner and then thinking about how do I adjust myself in response to these animals. So I think there's something about the rewilding of us that happens through the activities of these animals on the sites.
It's true. And I mean, there's a very strong education element that comes with that. But there's a balance as well, because of course our nature reserves are places that are also visited by people. Not all of them, but certainly the larger ones where you've got public access or you've got trails. We've put trail networks in places like Helmand Tor. People will use it. Our members, of course, want to. They're supporting the work we're doing, but the public more broadly do. And when you've got livestock, of course, if you've also got dog walkers, that brings all the challenges that we know in the countryside. I mean, fortunately, most of these places, we're talking about fairly low levels of human visitation and not that many dog walkers. These are still not inaccessible areas, but, Cornish country lanes. And not a lot of parking. So you've still got to be able to manage the potential for conflict there as well.
Definitely.
Right. We are a good number of minutes into this chat and we haven't got to... We've tantalised with Tour de Shore and the phrasing, the wording and discussed little bits about it. But please, could you give us an overview of the project, how it came about, inception, and also where we're at now?
Yes, will do. So I started talking about our nature reserves as the places that, we've focused on for many, many years. But the mantra in conservation is you need to go beyond that. We need bigger, better, more joined up nature recovery areas and habitats for species. And so our thinking, like a lot of wildlife trusts, a lot of other nature charities, is how do we start to work with neighbours? How do we build out from our core reserves and create real, true landscape scale conservation initiatives? The particularly unique thing about the Tour to Shore project is that we've gone a step further and said, how do we create interconnected landscapes and seascapes? So Helmand Tor, which is one of our flagship reserves, is a rocky outcrop in a moorland area in mid-Cornwall that sits distinct from the big moors like Bodmin Moor, which is a little further east. So it sits out there on its own like a pinnacle in the landscape. You stand up there, you can actually see both coasts. It's an extraordinary wild place. And it sits at the top of a catchment that runs south down to St Austell Bay. And St Austell Bay, we have discovered over a number of years of monitoring, has one of the largest seagrass beds in the UK. And also really fascinating, it has a lot more of a thing called merle than anybody previously realised. Now, merle, if you've never come across it, is a kind of calcareous seaweed. It's sort of hard. It's almost like a sort of Cornish coral, I suppose, in some ways. It's not a coral. It is a seaweed. And it grows incredibly slowly. Some of the merle beds around the coast down here, they think are 4,000 years old or more. So it's really, really slow growing, but it locks up carbon, as you can imagine. It's a phenomenal nursery ground for species. We've got seahorse, all sorts of things in there, just like the seagrass. And, it's equally challenged by not only marine activities, sort of trawling, dredging, anchors, all that kind of thing, which, if you get that kind of damage, it's going to take a long time to grow back, but also by water quality and what's running off the landscape. So come back to the Tour to Shore project. The idea behind that is that we work from the top of the catchment right the way down to the shoreline and the bay, conserving and rewilding the areas that we manage at the top for all sorts of good reasons, not only the great habitat and species that are there, but also holding water in that landscape. It's a sponge if you get it right. And then working with landowners through that catchment to improve landscape management, nature-friendly farming, those kind of things, in a way that then creates more space for nature and also helps with the runoff into the river and down into the bay. And then working right down to communities and marine users in the bay to directly work on managing and monitoring and celebrating the nearshore marine life and habitats that we've got there. So creating one interconnected land and sea nature recovery area.
That sounds amazing. Wonderful, in fact. And I was going to ask about why should we care about the seagrass and what it has, but I think you kind of answered that with it becomes that nursery for other wildlife, is that, and obviously the sequestration elements, which is good.
They're incredible for that. They are. And in fact, the Wildlife Trust released a report this week, I think, on blue carbon. In other words, the potential to lock up and absorb carbon around our coasts in our marine habitats, whether that is kelp, seagrass, mudflats, whatever it might be. And it's extraordinary, many, many, many more times than we would be able to absorb within woodlands, simply because of the acreage that's out there. So these are phenomenally valuable habitats from that perspective, as well as the fact that they're so rich in marine life.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. It's lovely. And we've got got lots of volunteer groups around the coast in Cornwall that we work with that are obviously very passionate about protecting their beaches, their bays and marine life. And they're out there, whether it's monitoring rock pools, whether it's out there snorkeling and monitoring the bays, and the things that they come back with is just incredible. And it really inspires people.
I love that idea of the interconnection between that high point and the sea. And yeah, it's really inspiring as a concept. And I think our listeners will probably feel sort of relatively familiar with this idea of using rewilding principles on a nature reserve like you've described with the livestock. But we haven't really talked about nature-friendly farming and what that actually looks like. So I wonder if you could just give us a description around what you might be asking farmers and landowners to do in order to kind of promote natural habitats on their farms.
So, I mean, there's all sorts of terms, nature-friendly, regenerative farming. The key thing is it's not so much what we're asking farmers to do, but how we're helping farmers to unlock opportunities that are both good for nature, good for farming, good for their businesses and livelihoods. Because, at the end of the day, particularly in an area where you've got lots of smaller scale farmers, it's not an easy business to be in. And the last thing a farmer wants, is some nation that coming banging on the door telling them something wrong. They should be doing it differently. We've been working with farmers and landowners for many, many years in other parts of Cornwall. And the key there is obviously building up good, close, trusting relationships with them. But our farm advisors who've been doing that work, the key for them is always sitting down around the table with the landowner, with the farmer, and looking at their business and where there are opportunities to improve things for them. And with nature-friendly farming, there are various things that come into play there. Obviously, there are government grants for habitat management, whether it's changing hedgerow management or woodland creation or putting herbal lays on areas of pasture, putting in ponds, all sorts of things like that, which is one end of the spectrum. There's money there to deliver those kind of public services, I guess, through nature recovery. But then the other side of it, of course, is things like inputs onto the farm. There's obviously a lot of chemical inputs, a lot of runoff in some of these steeper catchments. And so helping farmers to think about their inputs, what they really need. I mean, a lot of it is around soil testing and discovering that often farmers are putting far more onto a field than they may need to. So there's a cost saving straight away there. The other is how you manage those fields to avoid or minimize some of the soil runoff, because all the value in the farm is in the soil and soil health. So if you can create healthy soils, then also don't run off into the river. You're having a benefit for the farmer, you're having a benefit for everything that's downstream. So it's that combination of the sort of greener farm advice and the browner farm advice, I guess, which is the magic mix to getting where we want to get to.
I love that framing as it being an opportunity, because it's an opportunity in so many levels, an opportunity for nature, an opportunity for people, and an opportunity for economics in terms of as you say, the profitability of the farm. I suppose this is quite a naive question perhaps, but are you going around and knocking on farmers' door and saying, hi, we're the Cornwall Wildlife Trust and we want to do this tortoise project. Are you interested? Or how did you go about engaging all these critical stakeholders in this project?
Yeah, no, well, it's exactly that in many ways. You do start by knocking on doors. You might organise local community meetings. You might have farmer champions already who have gone a long way down this route themselves already and are great as a way of demonstrating to others what's possible, because you're talking peer-to-peer then rather than having a wildlife trust come in and talk. But you're right. I mean, with this project, as with many of them, it starts with a lot of consultation, a lot of talking to people, and that will continue. So we're now where we've got to with the project, and the grand vision is there. Some of the early steps have been put in place. We've started on the rewilding journey on our own reserve, the top. Obviously, been working for many, many years in the bay itself, looking at what's happening there. But we're in a year of really intensive development phase right now, where we're building those partnerships, those collaborations with communities, with landowners, with the marine users as well, fishers and the rest of it. You can't stop doing that. That's the heart of everything else. However much ecology we do, however much direct conservation we do, this project will only work if people living there want it to work and want to participate in it. And so far, there's been a huge amount of enthusiasm. There's no doubt. I think because, there's a sort of a bit of a grand vision there, if you like. There's something quite inspiring behind it. And because I think, the way we have worked has been to go in and get people involved rather than going and tell people what we're doing. It's very much then from the ground up. And whether it's farmers, whether it's community groups, there's a lot of people who care about this stuff one way or another. A lot of people who are looking for ways to make a difference and get involved. And the publicity that started to flow around Tortoise Shore, we've seen a lot of reaction to that.
So to steal a bit of Chloe's thunder here and ask a Chloe question, there's got to be a lot of data that you were hoping either baseline capturing now and plan to demonstrate, because This sounds like the future. It sounds very, very sensible for lots of wildlife trusts to look at, explore if they could do something similar. But that only works if you can evidence the benefit to nature, to the community, to businesses, etc. So I hope there's some sort of data nut, as you might say, that's in the organisation going, right, we're going to sit down, let's do this properly from day one.
You're very right. It's a huge part of being able to get this right and inspire people and convince people that it's the right way forward is having that evidence base to show for it. And of course, there's lots of evidence out there of this from elsewhere, but there's nothing beats something local and on the ground in terms of evidence. So, as a wildlife trust in general, again, a lot of our membership are very keen naturalists. There are lots of volunteer recorders, if you like, across the county, as there are in many parts of the UK, who are forever out there monitoring, submitting records. We host something called the Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Environmental Records Centre, which is a huge repository, so you can imagine, of information on species habitats across the county, which has been used obviously to track the decline in nature over time. What we're now beginning to do much more of is much more targeted and structured monitoring to be able to tell that before and after story of how interventions like this really do make a difference and what they're doing. So with the farm advice work we've done elsewhere in the county, one very long running project we've been involved in, invested quite heavily in that from the outset. And there was a really solid monitoring and reporting base to it. So, you could start to look at what change was really happening on those farms and, could we track it back to the kind of interventions that were being put in place. The challenge with all of that is often the resources to plow into monitoring when ultimately people want to get on and do the doing. And the other is ensuring that you have a strong scientific basis to the monitoring you're doing. It isn't just about recording what's being seen, but it's about creating something that's robust scientifically. Again, we're really lucky to have a couple of fantastic universities down this way that we work with in different ways on this, so we can tap into top knowledge and innovation and a good group of people that help us design things. So I think as we go forward, and obviously when it comes to nature recovery, it can take time. Some things can be very instant in terms of what you see. Things can take time. We will have a strong evidence base to, if nothing else, to be able to tell the fabulous stories that we're going to be able to tell from the changes that will take place over the coming years.
What I'd like to do is to step back a little bit, and we touched on the marine element to this whole project, and that is yet another area that we haven't dug into on the podcast so far. And now I'm very confident that's a whole podcast in itself, if not a whole 100 episodes you could do on it. Could you just give an overview of what that actually means, marine conservation or marine rewilding, what interventions, if anything, you're doing? And then I guess, similar to farmers, fishermen and women, it's how do you engage with them and what are the challenges associated with it?
Good questions. So marine conservation, marine rewilding, inevitably very, very different to on land, in large part because there's not that many direct interventions you can do. Most of it is about alleviating pressure. If you can take the pressure off those marine systems, they will in general bounce back. We've seen that with marine protected areas all over the planet, where if you reduce the offtake or the pressure, whether it's from communities or from fishing, anchors, dredging, whatever it might be, things will bounce back. So that's at the heart of what I guess we're doing there and it's a twin-pronged approach. On one level, it's reducing the inputs from the land, so taking off those pressures in terms of inputs, pollution and siltation. And on the other, it's working with people who use the bay in ways that inspire them to either protect it or to change the way they're interacting with it and to reduce those direct human pressures on it, even if it's temporary, seasonal, closures, parts of it, whatever it might be. We've seen elsewhere things like voluntary marine reserves, where fishers and the local community have collectively said, okay, we're going to manage this in a different way ourselves. In the absence of a top-down regulation, some legal protection, those kind of things. Okay, what can we do? Because actually it benefits us, and we're going to see better returns, because the nursery grounds are creating more and better fish and seafood or other means of benefiting from it. So a lot of it is around that, how you influence others to do that. But having said that, there are some direct interventions you can do, whether it's putting in place artificial habitats that will then stimulate marine species to colonize and recover. So we see that sometimes on harbour walls and things. What we're doing is a really interesting project around replanting seagrass. So this is not the subtidal seagrass that we have in St Austell Bay, but elsewhere along the coast where you've got tidal mudflats, and there's a dwarf seagrass species which is the most threatened. I mean, it's really disappeared, and a lot of those mudflats, it's gone completely. But there is some left, and we've been working on a really fascinating project to harvest the seeds, and they're tiny, and there's thousands of them. It's painstaking work, and it's very muddy work. But getting out there, harvesting the seeds, and then germinating them, and then going out and replanting and reseeding some of these beds. Sounds crazy, I know, but it's beginning to generate some real results. And if you can tie that with improvements in the water quality and improvements in the disturbance regime, then we think we could start to see some of this stuff come back.
And I think you've just answered my question, or my follow-on question, which was going to be, why is the seagrass disappearing? And I imagine it's to do with the water quality and disturbance that's happening.
I think with that, is a lot of it is the water quality is having big issues in those areas, but obviously things like dredging in channels that are navigable, big impacts. Same with the merle. Some of the merle beds are quite well protected. Others will suffer anchor damage. But we think, again, with the merle, that the runoff and the water quality, when you start to see algae growing over the merle, you know that there's too much nutrient input there, and that's going to have an impact. Again, that's why I think the interesting bringing together of what we do on land with what we do in the sea and under the waves is key. Those realms have often been dealt with separately. You have your sort of marine conservation side over there, and your terrestrial over here, but this is, and in Cornwall with, the land and sea is so interconnected, we're never far away from the sea. So it kind of makes sense that we try and do that.
Thank you so much for giving that quick overview, Matt. I think definitely be something to explore in more depth in another podcast, because it's something that we're not that close to the sea, so it's not something that is part of our daily thinking, but I think it's a really interesting subject given we're such a coastal island in the UK. So with all of these visionary projects, there's the things that drive us forward in terms of what we're hoping to get towards and the impact we're going to have. And there are sometimes things that get in the way and are challenges on the journey. And I wonder whether you want to reflect briefly on what have been some of the bumps in the road as you've worked towards this aspiration.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously one of them is having the resources, having the funding to, we have these great grand visions and plans, and you're forever on that search for resources. And it never always comes quite when you need it, when you want it. But when it does, it's fantastic. Then there are the unusual things that happen. And one of them for us this year was the unexpected arrival of beavers on the moor just below Helmand Tor. We've been working for a little while with neighbours to warm them up to the idea that we would apply for a free release of beavers on the land, because they would have such a great impact in terms of the water management on that area and the nature value of the area as well. We've seen it in so many places, and the government have held off on approving free release licenses for beavers. Although I believe in Wales now, that might have just been something that's changed. So congratulations if you're a step ahead there. Anyway, as we were doing all of this, suddenly a walker contacted us, said, I've been out on the moor, I've seen signs of something, I don't know what it is. We went and looked, and it was like, that looks like beavers. Gosh, what are we going to do now? So, you suddenly kick into gear with right, we've got to find out, how do we manage the story around this? How have they got there? Have they they escaped from an enclosure somewhere nearby? We ruled that out pretty swiftly. Does that mean somebody's turned up and dropped them out the back of a van? We know these things happen. They have happened elsewhere, pretty likely. Nothing to do with us at all. But when you're in the midst of a campaign to try and warm people up the idea of it, suddenly beavers show up. It sort of deflected us a bit. And of course, are they then in the right place? Are they going to stay? What are they going to do? They have, in the 6-7 months since they've been there, now they've started damming, which is great, other than they seem to have dammed in a place that means that our main wilderness trail through the reserve is now completely underwater. so our boardwalk is going to need to be elevated. But these are nice problems to have, I guess. It's part of that unexpectedness that makes it all, I think, quite fun. And again, fortunately, I think because we had a beaver officer in place for the last year or so, we'd already cultivated a lot of those relationships locally, and it made it a much smoother landing than it might otherwise have been. We do need more. We're still chasing that license application, because we could do with a few more to ensure genetically they're all fine, and because the landscape can take it. It's nice to have them there, but suddenly we're running around trying to put cameras in place and trying to manage the story and manage beavers rather than perhaps what we would have been doing that month or that quarter. Yeah, that's one of the key things. I suppose the other thing with all of this is, and as I've said right from the beginning, is the key to making this and any project work on a scale like this is the involvement of others. It's public involvement, it's landowner involvement, it's all of that side of things. And getting that right is a long-term business, long-term challenge. And we think, we've built ourselves up to be focused on that And I think in many of our places, we have developed and we've maintained really strong and close local relationships. And of course, as a membership charity, we're supported by a wide swathe of the public within the county. But there's always an unknown to that. And there's always, things that can derail you. You never know where you're going to find the pocket of real support and where you're going to find something that can create havoc with that. But in large part, that's been a really positive journey, I would say, for us. But it's always the thing that you're most focused on trying to ensure you get right.
I've really heard that throughout the interview today. It's really thinking about, how do we bring people along with us has been absolutely a thread throughout. And I wonder, as we come towards the end of the conversation today, if it's worth just revisiting. We've talked about the vision and we talked about the importance of landscape scale recovery, but I wonder whether it's worth kind of going back to why is this quite so critical? And in that, you mentioned how people have been inspired by this idea and the need for resources, and there has been some resource offered to support this idea. And I wonder whether it's worth commenting on that and some of the finances that are going to be required to achieve this vision.
Yes, no, for sure. So we've been supported, as I say, by members for a long, long time. And actually members, whether it's through their regular subscriptions monthly and annually, whether it's their response to appeals from time to time, or whether it's through legacies, gifts and wills, have helped us to build up not only our reserve network, but the wider work we do around that. And most recently with this project, our Helmand Tor complex of reserves up on the top of the catchment, there was a piece missing, a piece right in the middle, which was a farm. And the family there decided they were going to move on, and we were able to secure it and make it part of the reserve. In fact, that's the kind of heart of the rewilding piece, because it's taking some extensive pasture and returning it into a wilder state. That was really only made possible because our members and some very generous supporters got behind a campaign to allow us to buy it, which is phenomenal. We have subsequently now worked with the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who have come in and are supporting us this year with a development grant for a year to help us really shape up the plans and start to, if you like, to take the local consultation to the next stage. And if that all goes well, they'll then support us for another 5 years, with a significant figure. And that's going to make such a difference, because that will allow us to go beyond a bit of rewilding here, a bit of nature management there, a bit of community engagement there, a bit of work with the fishing community there, into something that's really joined up. And I think once you get a big supporter like that, it then will draw more people in, sort of fill in the gaps, because it's going to inspire more people with what we can achieve.
And just returning to that kind of last point around the joining up. So why is that joining up just so critical for nature?
So coming back to all the data we've got, all the monitoring over decades, we see the same pattern here as we see in Wales, as we see in the UK, as I've seen internationally throughout my career, which is for all the little wins and the great wins we may see in conservation in places or on particular species, the general pattern has been a downward one. We're seeing that slow, inexorable decline in nature over time. And we've got to bend that curve in another direction. We've got to see that curve bending back upwards. We need to see nature in recovery if we're going to survive, if our societies and our economies are going to survive. We won't do that unless we can do it over far greater scales than we currently are. And we won't do that by declaring the whole of Cornwall a national park and stopping people doing anything in it. It will be by getting people to do it themselves and supporting them and inspiring them and helping them and enabling them and encouraging them. And in some cases, campaigning and advocating for change when it comes to the rules and regulations and incentives that will help more people to be able to do that. And I think what goes alongside that is if people are involved and people understand, people are inspired, then people will value nature more and will want to deliver more. And if we can help to give people more of an opportunity to do that, we will then see the step change we need to see, which we won't achieve just on our reserves. That will just be islands in an increasing sea of nature devastation.
I really like that answer, Matt, because I think what I'd imagined is you'd start to talk about connectivity of wildlife corridors and stuff, but actually what you've talked about is people, and how if people shift their relationship to nature, then nature's going to be the beneficiary of that, as opposed to the kind of physical changes. So, thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation and covered so many areas. Is there anywhere that you'd want to signpost people to who are interested in finding out more or perhaps supporting the project?
Sure. Well, our website is up there, cornwallwildlifetrust.org.uk. There's lots of information there and pointers there to how people can get involved. We've got a fairly robust social media presence, so there's stuff out there as well. And, People in Cornwall, there are so many ways you can get involved, whether it's volunteering on the reserves or even volunteering here in our headquarters, whether it's joining a local group, whether it's doing something in your own back garden or your own community space, or whether it's supporting us by becoming a member or a supporter in some way. There's so many different ways. And we're just delighted by every bit of support we get. And as you said, I've talked a lot about people. I'm an ecologist. I love being out in the wild. It's, the ultimate answer to, what does success look like is more nature everywhere. But we do that by building our tribe, by building our constituency of support, by getting people involved because they want to, because it makes a difference to them.
Awesome. Everything you just discussed there will be in the show notes. And thank you very much, Matt, for your time. We got there in the end. I think it's been a great conversation.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you both.
So we'll find it suspicious that Matt had this beaver officer in place and then suddenly the beavers arrived. Not that I'm a conspiracy theorist.
Interestingly enough, that actually connects into my first reflection of the interview. Not about conspiracy theories, but about the power of surprise, and how I really loved quite early on in the interview when Matt was talking about his definition of rewilding and this idea of letting go of the outcome and kind of leaving yourself open to the possibilities that might be created that might include beavers and that might include beavers flooding your path. And I was thinking about our experience of the pigs, and
you brought the pigs again. Now, I wasn't going to, and there was a clear opening to mention pigs then. I wasn't going to do it. By the way, keep going.
Because what have they done, Tom?
Well, they've just routed my path. There's a wilder wander around our lands, permissive path to allow anyone to join it and enjoy it. And they've intentionally, because that is just the easiest place to routle, there are strips of 1.5 meters wide that they've routed through, which we talk about. Again, good chance and opportunity to pitch episode 29, previous podcast, where we talk about this in more detail. So if you haven't listened to that and you've got this far, it might be worth stepping back to listen to that one.
But I think what I was wondering about was the emotional impact of conservation versus rewilding. Bear with me. Because with conservation, you have a fixed idea of either the habitat you want to protect or the outcome you want to reach. So really, there's only room for disappointment when you don't get there. But with rewilding, we're like, oh, wow, there's a blackthorn sucker that sprouted on the path. That's amazing. Or, oh, look, there's this new flower. It's St. John's wort. What's that doing there? Like, it just becomes this fantastic journey of discovery as opposed to trying to get to a fixed place.
Yes, but I don't want to be Mr. Cynical here.
Mm-hmm.
However, funding doesn't like no fixed place. Funding has to prove that funding has been put into point A and the output is Y, because that's how they show they're having impact with their funding. Rewilding projects make it extremely hard to prove impact other than look at all this surprise. And yeah, funders don't like that. So
that is true, and perhaps shows the need for rewilding projects to be particularly creative in their diversification of income sources.
Easier said than done.
My second point of reflection is about the power of the uniting vision or story. And I thought that's what Matt really conveyed today. This idea of Tor, this highest point to shore, I thought was a really inspirational idea that anyone can understand, anyone can get behind. And I think it's described on his website as the most ambitious nature project in Cornwall. And I think what was particularly fantastic about how he's curated this vision is it was something that was co-constructed alongside local stakeholders and local people. And I think that's so critical because we know from our experience in Wales how sometimes coming in with a imposing vision without bringing the stakeholders along can be problematic.
And then from a marketing perspective and fundraising perspective, maybe this is part like diversification, being creative. It's going, right, okay, we need funding to do a nice thing. How do we package it up in a way that people get and want to support and put their money behind, which it sounds like they've done a great job of.
So thank you, Matt, and we look forward to seeing how that project develops over the next 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah. I'm waiting for the invite for us to go down there, personalised tour. That'd be nice.
I'm sure he'd be up for it.
So if you've got this far, there is still time, so don't worry. We've got our third community day and it's happening on the 19th of October, which is this Saturday coming up. The link will be in the show notes. If you want to get involved, want to meet the pigs, if you want to hear about or experience a rewilding project in its infancy with the Grange project, you'd be welcome. We're in Monmouthshire and we value anybody that wants to come with any experience. And the best thing about it is just everyone is super, super welcoming. We're going to be planting a tiny forest of 600 trees in a relatively small area using a really cool and innovative planting method, which is going to be the basis of our outdoor classroom. And there's also still plenty of things to do in terms of wrecking out fences and just reverting the land back to its more natural state. And before I move on, last thing to mention is that food will be provided and you'll be very well hosted.
That's the plan.
Anything else, Chloe?
I don't think so. Just to say, if you're interested in that, sign up on our Volunteers Day page, which we'll put on the show notes.
Already mentioned it. Thanks very much.